busy all day. Their fire is being directed at Iraqi tanks dug in along the main highway. But at one stage, the company commander called for more American air support.
Chris, on top we've got a Wild Eagle mission coming in to have a look in depth.
Yes.
Have you got it yet?
No.
It's tougher going than the British expected. Tanks are being targeted by machine guns mounted on the back of civilian pickup trucks. With their overwhelming combat power, the coalition are winning. The decimated remains of Iraqi armour litters the road. The strikes are so powerful, it melts the tracks. Progress is sometimes frustratingly slow. The troops are digging in for a lengthy stay as artillery bursts overhead. Just how long it will take to reach Basra is still impossible to forecast.
Difficult to tell at the moment. The situation is quite confused in Basra itself. We're getting sort of pockets on the outskirts, which have obviously been told to try and delay us. They're interfering with us as we try and cross the bridges, using indirect fire mortars. So we're expecting some opposition in Basra, certainly.
Iraqi soldiers who've surrendered are brought behind British lines, but all the indications are that many more are still in the city and prepared to fight. The battle for Basra is still raging along this road. The Fusiliers have managed to move up a couple of miles in the face of constant enemy fire, but they are now on the outskirts of this strategically important city. The battle group is closing in on its target, but taking Iraq's second city is proving to be an uphill struggle. Juliet Bremner, ITV News, Basra.
John, air operations do continue around the clock. In fact, right now we have a recovery taking place on the deck above me, so you may hear a loud noise if one of the aircraft lands while we're talking here. Earlier tonight, we saw many jet planes taking off from the deck here of the USS Constellation bound for Iraq. Some of them are taking on the strike role and striking with missiles and bombs. Others are dropping leaflets. They are dropping leaflets ahead of the advancing coalition forces, attempting to convince Iraqi soldiers that they should surrender. Some 28 targets have been serviced, as Rear Admiral Barry Costello put it during our most recent briefing, during the most recent 24-hour cycle. The targets being hit: air defense, leadership targets, and as we said a moment ago, they are also dropping leaflets. And in between the flights, as we bring you back live here, you can see some of the maintenance that's taking place on the jet of an F-14, a young green shirt here underneath the F-14. That's the sort of activity that takes place as an aircraft lands. There's maintenance that takes place. Bombs are reloaded or leaflets are reloaded, and then the aircraft begin another evolution and go back out.
Since Sunday afternoon, U.S. Navy ships in the Mediterranean have launched as many as 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles at undisclosed targets in Iraq. This is the first time that Tomahawks have been launched from the Mediterranean in this campaign. The missiles, we're told, were launched by 3 ships accompanying the 2 U.S. aircraft carriers in the eastern Mediterranean, the cruisers Cape St. George and Anzio, and the destroyer Winston S. Churchill. Sources here tell us the missiles were fired through Turkish airspace, and we understand until the Turkish government agreed to overflight, these launchers were not really feasible from this location in the eastern Mediterranean. So
coalition forces are using planes and tanks in a fight to force pockets of Iraqi fighters from the southern port town of Qasr and the Four Peninsula. It's Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf.
1st Airborne's 3rd Brigade just arrived here in southern Iraq after a 3-day absolutely whirlwind, breakneck speed convoy from Kuwait. The troops never stopping for more than a couple of hours to switch out drivers or to refuel their vehicles, really just moving through as quickly as possible. But they still did have an opportunity to see some of the Iraqis and the Iraqis to see the troops for the first time in a lot of cases, and some very interesting interactions. We went through a total of 3 towns. The first town, the troops got a very warm response from the Iraqis. A lot of the Iraqis turned out on the street to wave to the Americans as they passed through, also to give them the thumbs up, to shout hello, The American troops throwing MREs, meals ready to eat. That's the field food that the troops carry with them to a lot of the Iraqi children holding on to those MREs very proudly. Quite an interesting scene. The second town, not at all that way. As one soldier put it, a very eerie feeling going into that town. The soldiers went into the second town in the dead of night. The Iraqis there not cheering the troops as they came through, simply watching them. As the commander put it, it felt like it had all of the ingredients for a potential ambush. He said, thank God that didn't happen. The third town today, the reception, again, very, very warm. A lot of Iraqis churning out on the sides of the street to at least watch, curiously watch, or clap and greet the Americans as they pass through. In fact, the atmosphere was so welcoming that the American field commander found it fit to get out of his car and to meet some of the Iraqis on the ground. So really, obviously, an interesting dynamic there. Some places a very warm reception, other places a little cooler.
May be gearing up to fly out on a mission. Two flew out around about lunchtime today. They have an enormous payload, 20 cruise missiles, 30 tons worth of ordnance they can take. Just let's hear the engines warming up, I think. Yes, it looks as though they're going to be on their way fairly shortly towards Iraq. Obviously, we haven't got a clue what their mission is, but they do carry a lethal payload, and their flight time to Iraq is about 5 to 6 hours. And we would expect that in the course of the next half hour or so that we might well see them taxiing down the runway at Fairford and off into the night sky, and if that indeed happens, we'll go back to RAF Fairford.
Adjust a mortar tube and fire sporadic bursts from heavy caliber machine guns towards Kurdish lines. Kurds take cover in the virtual ghost town of Kalak. Kalak nestles beneath the Iraqi fortifications, a Kurdish frontline community that has lived in the shadow of Saddam Hussein's forces for 12 years. Most people shut their shops here and fled their homes on the eve of war, but a few families remain, relatives of Kurdish fighters, and these two families with 18 children between them. Their fathers say there seems no point in running away. I'll take a chance and stay here, says Kamal Smai. If it's my fate to die, I'll die in my own home. And for the few who remain here, a hope that the apparent resolve of these Iraqi soldiers will soon break. Saddam Hussein's command and control of his northern front seem to be intact, but as coalition forces advance towards Baghdad, it may only be a matter of time before his troops start feeling the crunch. Brent Sadler, CNN, in Kurdish-controlled territory of northern Iraq.
There's the B-52 on the runway, taxiing is, I think, over. I think it's on its way. Precisely where it's going, but it's on a mission. And almost certainly others will be following shortly.
The prisoners of war,
احنا اصحاب قيم ومبادئ
we have values and principles.
قبل الاتفاقيات
And before the convention,
قبل اتفاقية جنيف
before the Geneva Convention,
واللي احنا نلتزم بها اكيد
and we abide and we adhere
لكن
to this convention.
قيمنا وديننا واخلاقنا ومبادئنا
Our principles, our values, and our religion
خلينا نعامل الأسير بما يستحق
make us deal or treat the prisoners of war as should be.
Setback. They see it as the cost of war,
No one at the Pentagon ever said that every victory would be bloodless and there would be no U.S. casualties. Taking casualties is not the measure of success. It's achieving the military objectives in a time frame that is reasonable. And the Pentagon insists that its war plan is on track and, in fact, that its main forces will be in the vicinity of Baghdad very soon. The way that the U.S. Central Command put it today is that Iraqi forces remain in, quote, grave danger, and that victory for the United States is certain. What military commanders call the sharpest engagement of the war thus far occurred at the southern Iraqi city of Nasiriyah, about 100 miles north of Kuwait.
Today was a tough day of fighting for the coalition, but we continue our attack to remove the regime and to destroy the forces supporting it.
U.S. Marines thought the main fighting was over at Nasiriyah, but they were tricked, U.S. commanders say, by Special Republican Guard forces who had infiltrated the regular Iraqi troops.
In one incident, a flag of surrender was displayed, and it was followed up by artillery fire. In another incident, there were troops dressed in civilian clothes that appeared to welcome the forces and then ambush them.
It was also near Nasiriyah where a U.S. military supply convoy came under attack after making a wrong turn.
I can tell you for a fact that we are definitely missing 12 Army soldiers that are unaccounted for, some of whom I believe ended up on Baghdad television.
In fact, Iraqi television aired gruesome pictures that showed what appeared to be the bodies of 4 dead American soldiers, along with interviews with 4 captured American POWs. Iraq said it would abide by the Geneva Conventions for the treatment of prisoners of war, but the United States said immediately that Iraq had violated those conventions by putting those pictures and interviews on television. Another report tonight that we should pass along is started with a report that came out in the Jerusalem Post, which Pentagon officials say may be something to it. It's essentially that the U.S. has captured a suspected chemical weapons site near Al-Najif, about 90 miles south of Baghdad. This site is suspected of producing chemicals that could be used in chemical weapons. The Pentagon officials are being very hesitant in saying exactly what was there, except they do confirm that the military forces that were protecting it have surrendered, that 2 generals are in custody, and they are providing information to the United States. Of course, one key thing the United States would like to find in this campaign is hard evidence that Iraq is in fact producing the chemical or biological weapons that it has insisted all along it does not have anymore.
The skies and heading for Iraq, but whether for the capital of Iraq, Baghdad, or for troop emplacements in the desert surrounding Iraq, Nasiriyah and Najif, we do not know. But we think that that is probably the 4th B-52 to have taken off tonight.
This armored column came under attack in Nasiriyah. The body of 1 Marine was being wrapped in an American flag and carried to a waiting helicopter which had just landed nearby. He was one of many Marines to die in this intense battle to control an important supply route for U.S. forces trying to reach Baghdad to the north. Nearby, a 2nd armored vehicle heavily damaged. Earlier in the day, only 6 miles away, another deadly attack against American forces in the region. A U.S. military supply convoy was ambushed as it lost its way around the unfamiliar territory. Many of those ambushed were killed or taken hostage.
Several hours after the Iraqi forces ambushed a U.S. military supply convoy, Iraqi forces continue to engage the U.S. military, who is responding with heavy machine gun fire and 40mm grenades.
Advancing U.S. Marines, many of them as young as 19 and seeing their first combat, called for air support as they attempted to enter the city of Nasiriyah. U.S. military commanders say helicopters and planes managed to destroy several Iraqi tanks, trucks and anti-aircraft batteries. But somehow commanders here say they did not manage to prevent serious losses in the fiercest battle yet of the Iraqi conflict.
Morning in southern Iraq is that British forces across the south have been coming under fire, mostly sniper fire. It's thought now by the British military people here at the headquarters that these attacks on the British troops are being carried out by elite forces, loyalists to Saddam Hussein, and not the supposedly demoralized regular army, which the British military had hoped would put their hands up and surrender early on. So basically the picture is of these elite forces having been stationed in the urban area.
Now this again is a tank brigade, likely in the days to come to take on the two heavily armored divisions that Iraq has in the Republican Guard just south of Baghdad. Let me tell you a little bit about today, because the mood and the tempo has definitely changed here. The tempo because for the first time the soldiers had a chance to sort of catch their breath, if you will, get a little sleep, change their clothes, get a drink, have a bite to eat, something that they really haven't been able to do as we've essentially been rolling for the past several days since Thursday night local time when this ground war began. But having said that, the atmosphere is also much more tense. They've heard through their military radios, on their shortwaves, and frankly by coming by and talking to us about the ambushes of American soldiers, about the fact that there are American soldiers now taken prisoners of war, about the fact that there are Iraqi units that have waved white flags and then fake surrenders and attacked American forces. So it's much more tense here. At one point today we had on this vehicle, which is the M88, the tank recovery vehicle, which we've been driving in, we had a sniper positioned here. We had one of the people on this 50mm machine gun here. We had another sniper in the back watching very carefully a building a couple hundred yards away from us where they were worried about possible Iraqi irregular opposition. Not so much because of the force that they might bring against them, but because of the possibility of mortar and artillery strikes.
British troops closing in on Basra, the second city of Iraq, are now effectively under siege. On the way, they blow up unexploded ordnance, making it safe for more troops to follow. Inside Basra, 1,000 Iraqi fighters are said to be holding out and keeping the population under Saddam's thumb. The people have been running low on drinking water, and the UN say it's a humanitarian crisis. To target fighters here, Britain and America have been bombing and bombarding Basra. They had high hopes of a spontaneous uprising against Saddam in this city. Instead, pictures from Iraqi TV show people who say they still love him. Meanwhile, British commanders are worried that in Basra and other towns, they now face a guerrilla-style insurgency.
What we're now seeing is elements of the regime's security forces fighting a slightly more irregular battle, positioning themselves in the built-up areas and coming out to threaten us while simultaneously oppressing the population.
So British troops are no longer facing a conventional army in southern Iraq. Instead, they could be vulnerable to hit-and-run attacks by small groups of what they describe as fanatical zealots, often dressed in civilian clothes.
At Tango 2-1 Bravo, we are receiving harassing occasional fire from the northwest.
As for Iraq's regular army in the south, much of it has surrendered. British troops guard hundreds of prisoners of war. On the battlefield, the British have found gas masks, suggesting that Saddam Hussein's own soldiers may have been expecting him to use poison gas against the invading allies. And the landscape here is scarred with trenches, where Iraqi troops set light to oil, hoping this thick black smoke would blind American satellites and reconnaissance planes. Burning trenches like this one are one of the Iraqi army's classic defensive techniques. There are lots of them, not only here in the south, now in Allied hands of course, but also up around the capital Baghdad, where Saddam Hussein will make his last stand.
Good evening from the Iraqi border. Just behind me in Iraq, Royal Marines are this evening still fighting for full control of the port city of Qasr. All day long, troops and machinery have poured through here, heading for the front line, and a battle they didn't expect to have to fight. And tonight there are similar battles taking place across Iraq. Coalition forces are meeting ferocious opposition, not from the regular Iraqi army for the most part, but from irregulars, Saddam loyalists fighting a sort of guerrilla war. Still, the American General Tommy Franks, overall commander of the coalition forces, was upbeat about it all this evening, saying his forces had made rapid and in some cases dramatic progress. So, day 5 of the war on Saddam, and what is the progress of the military campaign so far? Well, against all predictions, the south of the country is still far from being under coalition control. Royal Marines, as I said, are engaged in an operation to secure, street by street, the port of Qasr, and Basra, Iraq's second city, has been surrounded but not taken. Further north, US Marines are in a battle for Al-Naziriyah. Other US troops have got as far as the holy city of Najaf, about 100 miles south of Baghdad, but they're facing heavy opposition there too. In the north, the city of Mosul's been under heavy coalition air bombardment today. Kurdish fighters opposed to Saddam are in the fight there. Now, ITV News has a team of correspondents reporting on the front line of many of those battles. Juliet Bremner is outside Basra. Bill Neely witnessed the fighting in the Al-Faw Peninsula. But first, James Mates reports now on the battle for Naziriyah.
On Saturday night, American forces described the city of Naziriyah as securely in their hands. It is not in their hands, nor is it secure. All morning, US and Iraqi forces have exchanged mortar and heavy artillery fire. Marine units who have entered the city are reported to be bogged down and withdrawing to allow air power and artillery its turn to try and crush the resistance. We went into the city this morning with a Marine unit charged with clearing a route through. Within minutes, we came under very accurate mortar fire. All the while, US tanks, hundreds of them, continue to head across country towards Baghdad. In these first 5 days, they have covered significant territory and appear to control a vast swathe of Iraq. But much of what they do control is simply empty sand. The cities still elude them. But Naziriyah is one they must subdue, and soon, because it controls the route north. Armoured personnel carriers and here an M1A1 Abrams tank continue to head for the city, and the battle ahead. The fires are blazing in the distance there. It is going to be a fierce fight for them. They had not expected to have to battle like this for a city like Naziriyah. It does not augur well for the upcoming battle for Baghdad. James Mates, ITV News, Naziriyah.
The coalition also still have to take Basra, which was always expected with its mainly Shia Muslim people, to drop easily into their lap. Not so. There are Iraqi regulars and irregulars putting up a real fight for Iraq's second city. Juliet Bremner is with the Desert Rats on the outskirts.
The British forces are tonight preparing for their final push on Basra, setting up their command headquarters here. But it's taken them 48 hours to fight through the last few kilometres into the city. They are now confident that they've secured the northern outskirts. But the Iraqis seem to be in no mood to give up, despite the fact that their city's taken a terrible pounding. And the troops, despite the number of casualties, and they must have been heavy, although numbers aren't known, do seem to be prepared to stand firm. They're taking their posts up on the roads that the British will have to enter if they're to take control of this place. The ordinary people, too, are intent on fighting. This group of civilians wave their guns in the air and shout their defiance and their determination to fight the coalition forces. When the final assault does start on Basra, it could prove to be far longer and far more deadly than many of the officers commanding these forces had ever thought. Juliet Bremner, ITV News, Basra.
Bill Neely has been with the Royal Marines on the Al-Faw Peninsula in southern Iraq. As he reports now, the Marines have met opposition, but this particular battle appears to be won, opening the way for reinforcements and humanitarian aid.
US Marines have begun paying a price for this invasion in dead and injured, but further south their job is almost done.
they met their British commanders. Light and heavy armour now pouring in across southern Iraq. The meeting of British and American troops here effectively seals off the Al-Faw Peninsula, trapping any other Iraqi troops still here. For both sides, British and American, it's mission accomplished.
I don't think we're quite at the stage where we can say that there is absolutely nobody left in this area who is hostile, but it's certainly mission accomplished. The mission, remember, was to secure the oil infrastructure before it could be destroyed. That's accomplished. And to secure the port of Qasr for humanitarian aid. That's accomplished, although, as I say, there are still some people in there who are not entirely friendly.
The Americans have been shaken by the deaths and capturing of Marines further north, but they don't rate the Iraqis they fought.
We had individuals that gave up instantly. We also had individuals that gave up a fight. The fight was short-lived.
There are still pockets of resistance on the Al-Faw Peninsula. The Royal Marines, in their first street battles here, have attacked them with heavy fire. They've now been called in to a southern port, vital for getting humanitarian aid into Iraq. They're here to attack Iraqi snipers and positions that American Marines have failed to clear. As the Iraqis abandoned their positions, they left behind their weapons, mostly light ones, including these rocket launchers. But more importantly, they left behind maps outlining their defensive positions across the south, maps that might help the Allied advance. The Royal Marines are now pushing north and onto the streets and into more danger. Bill Neely, ITV News, with the Royal Marines in southern Iraq.
The Royal Air Force has released combat pictures filmed from the cockpits of Harrier jets based in Kuwait. The pictures show strikes against the Iraqi Navy. They capture the moment a patrol boat suspected of laying mines was targeted by a Maverick missile in Basra harbour. Coalition bombs and missiles have been falling around the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, again this afternoon. Earlier, a defiant President Saddam Hussein appeared on Iraqi television again to talk about victory and glory for his side and to disprove the theory that he might be dead. ITV's John Irvine sent this report from Baghdad.
Another search following another report that an American jet has been brought down. Coalition pilots are highly prized. Saddam Hussein has promised thousands of pounds for their capture. We saw no evidence that this particular hunt in the centre of Baghdad ended with a prisoner being taken. It is possible, however, that the crew of this Apache helicopter are now in the hands of the Iraqis. Seemingly intact, the aircraft was forced down south of Baghdad and was quickly shown on television here. This is another significant TV appearance. Saddam Hussein showing he's still alive. The Iraqi president called the British and Americans the enemies of humanity and God. He insisted the coalition campaign was in trouble. He commended his forces and predicted victory would be theirs. Saddam Hussein is trying to inspire his forces to mount a spirited defense of every town and city, but especially of Baghdad, around which oil fires continue to blaze. The Iraqi president's tactics are clear. He's playing for time in the hope that something turns up. There is sporadic bombing round the clock. Coalition forces have been pounding Republican Guard units. They're digging in for the defense of Baghdad. Overnight, we also heard aircraft flying over the city centre. So did Iraqi Akak gunners. Of course, the jets continue to come here for one reason. John Irvine, ITV News, Baghdad.
View of the conflict. The city below is said to be Baghdad. The numerous flashes of anti-aircraft fire every now and then punctuated by a strike. From up here, there's little sense of the destruction caused below. Warned of a humanitarian crisis in the city if adequate supplies of drinking water are not restored soon. The coalition was hoping that Basra would oust the local Saddam infrastructure on its own. Not yet, apparently.